Hi everyone, I am Savio De Cruz. Today we are going to be continuing the pandemic short story playlist. Today's second story, it's called Seaman. Mr. Y and Mrs. Y had just gotten married and then coronavirus came along. Their honeymoon consisted of staying in a hotel room, playing cards, of course sitting at a safe distance of 6 feet. This cannot go on for too long, both thought. After all, both of them were ripe in age. They had to try for a child as soon as possible after marriage. That is what both had decided before marriage. But that was before the pandemic circus rolled into town. Now touching was equivalent to suicide. Nothing was known much about the COVID, and no one knew who was a carrier of the disease. As days passed by, they started checking for symptoms on the internet. Every now and then, they became convinced that they had contracted the virus. Mr. Y saw in the news that once you get the virus, your sperm motility reduces. He was worried about the potentness of his sperm from beforehand. Now he was even more worried. Mrs. Y saw in the news that sperm may be a way that one could contract the disease. She was terrified. She was afraid of sex even before, and now she was petrified. Mr. Y put in his mind that since his potentness had decreased, he would have to work twice as hard to achieve success. Mrs. Y, on the other hand, tried her best to avoid sex. Anytime they would get too intimate, she would pull off. Mr. Y was getting frustrated. His parents were putting pressure on him to have a child. So were his in-laws, as Mrs. Y was their only child. He felt that the onus was on him and he was disappointing them big time. So one day they sat down and discussed their woes. Mr. Y revealed his insecurity about his sperm. Mrs. Y revealed how she was afraid of sex. The discussion continued all night. It came to Mr. Y that Mrs. Y was not afraid of sex, but actually she was afraid of the contagiousness of his semen. He vowed to find a solution. The next day, he pondered over the conundrum. At mid-afternoon, he struck gold. He hurriedly called his wife and told her that just because of being afraid of semen, they should not stop having sex. They can use condoms. Mrs. Y's eyes lighted up. So they used the lockdown to having protected sex, and 9 months later, Mrs. Y turned up pregnant. She could not believe it. Mr. Y too could not believe it, but inwardly he knew. He had been carving out holes in the condoms so that the deed could be achieved. She gave birth to an ugly child. She blamed it on going over COVID's head and having a child. He blamed it on the condom, debilitating the strength, number and potency of his sperm.